My name is Ellie Kevorkian. I'm the Artistic Director for Residency Programs. This is a new orientation for us, so I may be rotating in my chair a little bit. Sparkle. Jazz hands. Welcome to our group discussion tonight, which largely mimics the discussions that we've had over the last 10 days. Structured group discussions as well as workshopping ideas from one another. This is the result of this great meeting of the minds, and I'm very privileged to sit at the table with all of you. Thank you so much for all of your efforts over the last 10 days. Liveness is Critical was developed in consideration of the boundaries between disciplines that seem to become increasingly more blurred. And what I felt was needed was a space to provide cultural workers focused on performance, space to have these critical dialogues on contemporary issues and performance. And in this way, we can sort of talk it out and figure out how to contextualize one another in various sites, deepen our research, and really consider other frameworks as we either present or make work or write about it. So at the table tonight, we have artists, curators, scholars, and writers, all focused on performance or performance art. And the vastness of our conversations over the last 10 days have been so vast and wide-ranging, literally so many talking points that we would never get to. We decided in the playful way that we have been able to sort of interact with one another, that we would select from various containers on the table our talking points, and then we will just move through it. How about you go around the table and introduce yourselves, say who you are, just take a minute to say who you are, where you're coming from, if you like your discipline or what your interest is, and we'll get started. Shoni.
Hi everyone, my name is Shoshona Courier. I am here from Chicago, where I work for the Department of Cultural Affairs and Special Events, and I specialize in theater and dance. I oversee a lot of our civic programming, and I also work independently with various organizations as well.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Denise Chapman. I'm a theater practitioner here in Omaha, Nebraska. So I act, I direct, I produce, and I write. I think that's all of them. I'm currently at the Union for Contemporary Art as the Associate Director for the Performing Arts Collective.
I'm Emily Johnson, hi. And I am a performer, choreographer, I make dances. And I work between New York and Minneapolis mainly, and tour and work widely and broadly.
Hello everybody, my name is Daniel Sack. I'm a professor of English and at the University of Massachusetts in Amherst, and I'm a writer and scholar of performance. I work on theater, dance, performance art, and try to figure out writing's place in relationship to live art.
Hi, everyone. My name is Travis Chamberlain. I am visiting you from New York City. I am a curator, a producer, and a director of live art with a background in theater. I am currently working at the New Museum, where I've been since 2007, as the associate curator of performance and manager of public programs. At that site, I've often worked with our site, the theater, as a kind of open studio research space for looking at performance-based research.
Hi, I'm Juliana Snapper, and I'm an opera singer and an art maker and a voice researcher. And I make performances with my voice and with other people's voices. And I'm here from Los Angeles.
I'm Abigail Levine. I'm a choreographer and performer, and I teach dance at Wesleyan University in Connecticut, live in New York, And I've done a fair amount of performing as a dancer in visual art spaces. And so that's one of the threads that we've been following during this week.
Should we explain the game, or should we talk about what Liveness is, which none of us have an answer for?
Well, we can start talking about liveness, maybe, and then we can move into our little live game that we'll be playing together.
You want to kick that off,
I'll kick
Dan?
it off because I feel like that's something that I've been living with as a writer and theorist of this particular field of practice. And just to, this question of what is liveness is something that's really been troubling scholars, writers, performers for quite a while. And to give a very, very brief overview of some of these like general approaches, we could think about liveness as something that's happening in real time with us, as something that is taking place in the present moment. All different kinds of art forms that are happening alongside of, in the presence of an audience, in the presence of other performers. And that brings us to this idea of maybe liveness being something that is becoming itself through disappearance, as something that's always passing, always ephemeral. And in that way, maybe resisting ideas of reproduction, of documentation, and that's something that we talked about a lot over the last few days, is how does documentation deal with these live events, these experiences? For myself, I'm particularly interested in the ways in which live performance also gives us an encounter with the time to come, with things that we don't know about the future, and how we deal with the future as it's coming into the present moment, how we anticipate what's going to happen, and how sometimes events might surprise us through moments of failure, if there's something that goes wrong, a mistake. Suddenly we're aware of the fact that this is not a pre-recorded event, this is not something that's known, or just ways that we might be holding the future open to the many different possible paths it could play out. So I think it's something that's been guiding us in different ways, and thinking about our responsibilities to each other in this live moment, how this might be a place where we come together as a community, or we feel our isolation from a community in the real time. But that nature of time, I think, is really important to what we're doing and what we're all working on in different ways. So I think that our game that we're going to be playing together is dealing with time and topics. And maybe Abigail wants to tell us about that, or somebody want to say more about liveness.
Well, I mean, my first live thought, right, is that we sort of set up this idea that, okay, well, it's us together in time, and then, you know, you're like, well, is the person that's here with me on my phone, is that live, or the person that's on the other side of the wall? And so immediately all the things that we hold on to, or I as a dancer thinking about, like, how much time I spend right next to another person, we can just sort of cut that down. And so we've been sort of struggling with that and celebrating that, and also trying to think about the value of that, and in relation to you know, a painting, that we have some sense that it holds value. But knowing that this live moment is as valuable, but how do we value that? And so sometimes we measure time. Here's a segue. And so what we're going to propose, and it will surely fall apart as soon as we begin, is that we have 3 containers that have our names, measures of time in minutes, and topics that come out of our week's discussion. And we're going to pull one of each, and the person whose name is pulled will begin our discussion. Unless they prefer not to.
And the discussion as a whole will be limited to this amount of time.
Right, so do we need a timekeeper?
I have my stopwatch.
All right. Oh, okay.
Topic.
All right, the topic is ethics. Ethics.
right in.
Oh, was I selected as the person to start us off?
Yes.
No. This is the person, I think. Yeah.
Juliana.
Juliana.
Hold on, let's get a duration.
6 minutes.
6 minutes max.
Don't worry, I'm not going to lecture you about ethics for 6 minutes. Although I'm a little tempted because you look like a pretty slippery bunch that might need that. I got interested in ethics because it's really the first. Is this working okay, or am I just hissing-ish? Okay. Because I didn't know if. I wondered how I could know, by spending all this time in the practice room, if I was getting anywhere, right? And how do you think about that? Like, how do you know that those 5 hours are going to, take you in the right direction? And especially with the voice, which is attached to a human body, which you drag through everything and is, crazier than you are. When you start singing, everything comes to the surface. It's really hard to tell what's happening day to day. So why that took me to Aristotle, I do not remember, and it's probably not a good story. But it came down to this idea that ethics lies in the choices you're making. So in a way, ethics is always aesthetics too, right? And vice versa. And that can become, at an extreme, right, then that reduces ethics down to meaninglessness, right? Or it can just be like, oh, it's just choosing a color, which is not obviously true. And it's also not true that every color choice has to do with, has great moral consequences, right? And maybe it is good to differentiate what we mean by ethics versus morality. And I'm going to hand that off to you.
Well, yeah. Sorry. I guess I'm thinking about that kind of choice that we're making in the moment, and maybe our preconceived ideas of what we're doing and what we're setting out to do, rather than being responsive to the people around us, the environment, the moment-to-moment changes that are happening. And that might be something in performance that is taking place between yourself and the other performers, or it might be yourself and the audience. There's a sort of the performance being something that's taking place not in one body, but in this sort of exchange between bodies. So it's always kind of an ethical relationship that one is negotiating, a kind of give and take of different consequences of this moment-to-moment thing. And I think about this myself as a writer all the time. What is my ethical responsibility for the work that I'm writing about, both to the people that I'm writing for and to the artists that I'm trying to represent, because one of the big problems we've been talking about a lot over the last few days is what happens to these performances after the fact, right? And what the documentation. How does writing negotiate? How does video? How does photography? How does the ephemera, the things that are left over? What do we do with them? And how do we maintain an ethical relationship to the people who made the work, or the people who were present at the work? And sometimes they don't want things to last.
Yeah, and this gets into the idea of stewardship that was brought up. And so, with artists who are creating work based on the experiences of non-artists, based on storytelling and interview, and so what is their stewardship of those people's stories? And then as a curator or as a writer, what is the stewardship of that work as it moves forward? And that for me is a lot of the ethical question, right? Is how we move this work forward. How can you protect it? Because if we were working with objects, right, you make sure it's packaged properly, you make sure it's climate controlled the way it needs to be. There's a system in place to move the work forward across continents, around the world, in a way that is ethically sound, But we don't. It's harder to protect a body. It's harder to protect a story and a history in that same way.
One of just thinking of some case studies that we talked about was with a former resident artist here who was working with the local community to capture stories about trauma, and then was taking those narratives with permission from the people that she was interviewing and consolidating that into a solo performance. And then we were thinking about sort of like, after you sort of sign that agreement to be documented in that process, you're putting your trust in the artist and sort of your permission to be have a stake in that after you've shared that story is arguably legally out of your control. And we cited a few other instances, the Tectonic Theater Project, who work as a company to go and interview, often to interview communities, also or generally around sites of trauma. Their most perhaps well-known project is the Laramie Project, where they went and interviewed the town where Matthew Shepard was murdered, and absorbing those stories and reperforming those, and then, or not reperforming, we can get into that in a second, but taking those stories, producing a script of that could then be enacted initially by those actors, but has since become a script that other actors who had no direct relationship to that community and capturing those stories now can, perform on their own. And just questions about, how are the profits from...
Yeah.
So in the case of the Laramie Project, right, or many plays, works like that get codified into a script form that is then published, there's protection around it if a version of it was happening somewhere that was going against the grain of the work, cease and desist, et cetera, et cetera. It's the same way there's insurance on an object as it moves around the world, like big insurance, right? But a question, in this sort of liminal space these performers occupy, right, where the work isn't necessarily being copyrighted, which is a huge, we didn't even get into like intellectual property issues this week, right? But the work is embedded on the bodies, and a lot of times only on the original bodies who created the work. How then it's murky, right? Then it's harder to find the copyright around that. Or actually, maybe you could talk about the work we talked about so much this week.
Yeah, I figured it would happen. Do we want to? We're breaking the rules.
Another duration.
All right, we'll give Abby
And the table.
3 minutes.
Okay. Only 3 minutes.
3 minutes to wrap this up.
Ethics, copyright, it's one of the projects that I was in was Marina Abramovich, who's a performance artist from the 1960s, 70s forward, had a retrospective at the Museum of Modern Art in New York in 2010, and about 40 of us, mostly dancers, were hired for our physical stamina and our whatever Marina could see in our eyes standing and looking at us, to reperform, which was the term that she used, 5 of her performance works from the 70s through the 2000s for 10 weeks. And we were installed very much as objects would be, with descriptions of the works and documentation of the original. And so there were endless issues about what we were next to her work, and did it become ours? We had a long process of contract negotiations that we ultimately made progress on by fainting during the first days of the show. It was hard for us to, within this context of the visual art, find a way to assert the value of our work. And in these first days, people started fainting, and as the museum went to reduce the risk by cutting our shifts, our pay accidentally doubled. And then over the course of these 3 months, these works became installed in our bodies. And I have traces of that in an arthritic joint from standing on concrete floors for 3 months. And so, you know, what the legacy is the video, the documentation. Am I the documentation? Can I perform this work? How does it come out in my work? So these are all sort of threads that are coming through, and where that gets into money and legal sense and ownership is all things that we're trying to give a bit of provisional form to.
And I just want to also talk about, for a moment, the ethics of the moment, you know, and what I think about the ethics of where we are and paying attention to where we are and who we are with, and the ethics of, in the moment of live performance, what we conjure both in our bodies and from the ether and from our histories, how that then relates to effect on the world or a potential effect on the world, and what our responsibility or part in ethics around that is.
Professionalization.
Or
It is what happens when interdisciplinary work that borrows from other disciplines is responsibility to having built a craft. Just saying, redacted. You have a right to all this information.
It's a
Professionalism.
Oh. Ellie.
I don't know where to begin with that. We were talking about technology. I think we were actually on a conversation stream about documentation and how digital technology has changed things so drastically for artists so that they are now able to actually build their own archives and document themselves and build their own websites and really put forward this great professional front. And it seems at times that artists now, knowing that they have this archive of documentation to produce, maybe sometimes present or actually produce work in knowledge of the archive that they're crafting. So in some ways, technology has affected the way artists are actually making their work and informing the direction that they go in.
Do we have a duration on this?
Yeah.
It's 4 minutes.
Great.
Yeah, I mean, I'll pass it on from that.
I was really curious about this as we had this conversation on documentation, because I am the anti-website person, mostly because I feel it becomes a different medium, and that's not the medium I work in, so I almost need to employ another artist to come in with that viewpoint to be able to document in a way that doesn't make the work go flat. But then we had this really beautiful conversation about archiving in bodies, and especially viewership, and how live performances then archived in the people who saw it. And I think back to conversations that you have with audience members, and we all kind of had those experience of engagement with people post-performance, whether that be in the space right after performance or even like months afterwards, which then circles back to liveness. Does that become like this new live moment based on a live moment that happened before?
We questioned when the event actually happened.
Yes.
Like for some people, like is the event when when everyone arrives? Are you guys at the event right now? Or maybe later tonight while you're lying in bed thinking about what you saw today and you're like, oh, I just had it, the event, it just occurred. Like you just, like maybe the event is this after effect of the gathering perhaps. And the other aspect, did you want to say? The other thing I was thinking about in terms of professionalization, though, was around, we've been talking about funding and granting processes and the language that is asked through applying for grants and how that produces a kind of, it asks the artist or the applicant to sort of comport themselves to a certain kind of language, and to in some ways assert a certain kind of professional identity. Mm-hmm. And this is sort of this back and forth, right, that like is building and professionalizing as it goes. So I just sort of wanted to throw that out as something maybe for further discussion.
And we also raised the question, as we as individuals feel pressure to, and as the larger art structures value those artists who become successful because they are able to professionalize, live by their art, sell their art for a lot of money, whether those of us who, or as artists who are also invested in experimentation and social change and connection that happens through art, if professionalization actually supports that or sometimes undermines it. And so just thinking about other structures of art making that have existed in history that produce other kinds of artistic experiment and connection.
Mm-hmm. Which I think very quickly leads to that the conversation we were having about privilege and professionalization.
I think we probably have limited time left. Maybe we should talk a little bit about the experience of coming from so many disciplines and trying to join into some kind of common language, or was that the goal? Was the goal to find a common language between us or to understand one another from our individual settings? And, you know, what does it mean to receive an MFA degree in the visual arts, but then also to be referencing dance and theater and what other, any other live or liveness discipline? And how do people like Daniel then research that from all of those different perspectives and lens and frameworks and create a cohesive statement about what it is that you witnessed or that you're contextualizing? So we have everyone at this table, from the theater to dance to the visual arts, and then some even sound, singing, vocals, opera,
and everyone
music.
here has multiple identifications.
That's right. That's right.
For me, it's less about like coming out with a page of best practices, which is a phrase I abhor at this point. Right. But it actually, it's gonna sound so goofy. I feel like it becomes, this conversation, all the points that we've raised this week, it becomes embodied within us, right? So that it's almost like when you're in that sticky situation, either as the artist, or I'll speak as, you know, as the curator or as a civic representative, right? When you're in this sort of sticky situation, this liminal space with a live body, but how is it going to do this, and who is the audience, and how are we communicating with that, and all these things, or somebody's not getting paid and they should be getting paid, and the question of ethics and value, and you know, then these are the conversations that become embedded in our own practices, you know, where I have such clear ideas now, especially hearing from performers who, you know, have been in, you know, sketchily paid situations or dangerous situations, and it's just this reminder of how to deal with those problems in your life, right? As opposed to putting out a manifesto into the world that's like, we should do this and we should do, those are great, those can be wonderful guidelines, but it's really like, how do you work in a moment and embody these values and continue to ask these questions and care for that conversation as it moves forward?
I mean, I think that as a writer, dealing with these many different forms of art making, many different institutions, many different communities, so often writing either happens before an event or after the event. You know, so often art writing is something that responds to what has already been seen, right? And sometimes thinks about what might be seen. But what's interesting about live performance is that and writing should change in response to that, I think, is actually that it could take place alongside of what's actually happening. And how can there actually be a conversation between writing and doing? To me, this week and a half has really brought that to my fore. It's like there needs to be more conversation between different disciplines, but also about, as the person I think in the room who does documentation the most as a writer, how can I be useful to artists and in conversation with artists, but also that the discipline itself is always, it's a language. It's a community that knows certain words. And so what language are we speaking together? And that means that the language has to change depending on who's in the conversation with you. And this has been really delightful for me to come in and have those different conversations in different languages.
I feel like one of the first things we started talking about was sort of challenging the idea of whether or not there needed to be sort of a merged vocabulary versus the idea of sort of operating from a specific, well, your own position and your own disciplinary background, and how that can operate within another disciplinary framework, and the sort of importance, perhaps, of asserting not conforming to the languages that of another framework, but bringing your own language into those and asking them to reshape themselves around you. I was thinking about your work and the process of engaging with community organizations, and the way that you have spoken about your work as dance, and that particular engagement as dance, as opposed to what is a sort of buzzword within visual art world, social practice or socially engaged art, and so things like that feel really important to me.
I think one of the things that was most difficult and most wonderful, ultimately, and spoke to the skill and trust of Ellie in particular, was that she kept refusing to set a particular goal, and so much of what I value and also what I'm constantly defending about experimental art making is that you don't know what the outcomes are going to be, and so to have a space and to continually reaffirm that we're just going together somewhere, with the specificity of being here. And we had a lot of conversations about here inside the Bemis, here in Omaha, here in the United States, but that process of just being together and finding a way has been a real gift and challenge of the week.
Denise, you will begin this one.
Oh, okay. 5-minute response on privilege. And I think some of this for me comes back to the conversation we had this morning. And we talk about folks arriving at art. And I think about some of, I call them my babies, but they're the young people I work with, who walk into a space and they're still in fight or flight because we're dealing with basic needs, and what it takes to support and get a community ready and in a place where we're thinking beyond where's my next meal, where's my access to grocery store, how do I get there? And these are some really challenging, important conversations for me, especially looking at my day gig and where I'm working and what I'm doing, and how do you infuse art in a greater community conversation that also needs to be talking about transportation and food deserts and safety and that need for not only that beautiful wrap-around love that art provides, but honest physical wrap-around love and support, so people know that they are valued and they are cared for and that they are important, so that when they step into creative spaces, right, they can step in fully and be able to find their creative voice. And how do we create spaces where they can see themselves represented in a way that they know that that's for them, because so oftentimes some folks have the privilege of being very comfortable in spaces because everyone around them looks like them. And then from the outside looking in, some other folks might think, well, maybe that's not for me. So how do we start really engaging and challenging some of that work and making space for everyone at the table and making sure those needs are met so when they get there, they can be there fully?
Just quickly, the privilege can sometimes be, it's used very simply, and in most cases it needs to be a shorthand for what gets talked about right after that, and that's everything that you just said, which is crucial. I just wanted to add that sometimes we miss the benefits, or this just gets kind of omitted from the conversation. What happens when you grow up with certain kinds of scarcity and you get really scrappy, right? And you learn certain kinds of improvisation that other communities might be deprived of.
I don't want to speak for your work at all, but I think that one of the things that I really admire about what you're doing is this sense of providing the privilege of voice and embodiment to communities or practices, professions, groups of people that aren't necessarily allowed a space to come together and express themselves and to tell their stories. People who are non-professional artists, but giving them the power to make art in some way, or to claim the language of art as a space of change in some way.
I mean, I think that is well said of my work. Thank you. And to me, it is that process of listening, process of getting to know, and process of getting to know, again, where we are and who we are with. And so if I'm coming into a place to work, the experts are the people who live there and the many different communities and facets of those communities. And from listening, from having conversations, whether they're very structured or very informal, and then building from there together, that's the only way that I know how to be ethical in making work and in trying to share work and in trying to honor and respect all of the histories and stories that are within all of our bodies. And when you do, yes, have food and have the things that you need to then speak a story or sing a story or just be still for a little bit and let your story emerge from your cells, like that, and we need that time too. We need that time together to build that. And I don't know. I don't think of it as I don't think of the word. It's interesting that you wanted to ask me about this, because I don't think about privilege. That word doesn't really come into my mind when I'm doing that work, privilege or not privilege. I want to spend time with people, both in the making and the sharing of what we make together.
Travis?
Citation, writing, language.
Citation, writing, and language.
4 minutes. We could see if we can find one that works.
4 minutes. Identity and experimental work. Communication.
I think I'll go. I'm referring to my notes. I think. Thank you. Thanks. I think with citation, I was thinking about two things. One, appropriation, both as like with all of its sort of negative associations, cultural appropriation, and then appropriation as a particular strategy to reframe or to perhaps reappropriate within performance. So that as a kind of citation or operation of citation. The other thing, which perhaps someone else at the table could speak about a little bit more, was our conversation around sort of the sort of millennial sort of condition of this idea of sort of regramming, reposting, that we are sort of living now in a culture where you just like touch a button and like the thing that you saw there now is suddenly within your frame, and how citation operates within that, and then how that translates, how we're seeing that being translated into performance. Yeah.
Oh, sure.
Yeah, it's authorship, and then I always come back to my favorite Erykah Badu quote, "I'm an analog girl in a digital world." Because there's this beautiful thing about the analog world where if you take a tape and make a copy of a copy and a copy of a copy, eventually you get fuzz. But in digital space, like, there's no difference. And so this idea of authorship and ownership and originality in the land of post and repost and share becomes really muddy and fuzzy, right?
I mean, one of my interests has been thinking about the sort of relationship between the artist as author and the performer within a work, quote, authored by that artist, and this sort of problematizing where authorship lies in that dynamic, where the performer has, in the experience that you receive when you encounter a performance, has some role in in my opinion, in the authorship of that moment. So how do you frame that so that that element of the performer's authorship becomes clear and apparent?
I mean, I think that one of the questions that we've been wrestling with ourselves is this adherence to the present moment, the benefits of that, and then the things that are lost along the way by focusing so much on what's happening right now, that performance is always doing. We have troubles of recording performance. We have troubles of remembering what our ancestors or our predecessors have done. How do we pass that on? How do we recognize what came before us? And I think that this is one of the great differences that, or the confrontation between, or the meeting place between performance and the visual arts is a productive dissonance, because the visual arts has this wonderful history of objects. You can go to a museum, you can see hundreds of years of stuff on the wall and put yourself in that relationship with what came before. Performance is in a different situation. What happened 50 years ago, 100 years ago, hundreds of years ago, what's being passed down from generation to generation takes place in other kinds of forms of memory. So citation is a different animal in performance. And I think that the visual arts is coming to terms with that, trying to apply its kind of logic of, let's collect these performances, let's put on museum retrospectives of these events that happened 40 years ago and treat them like they were objects, like they were paintings, but they're not. And so one of the interesting things we're all wrestling with is, like, what do we honor about performance, but also what can we learn from other kinds of tellings, and how can we cite other voices?